Thank you for taking the time again to come and listen and share on this subject of the Hebrew Tabernacle. And we're bringing this to conclusion now. And to do this, we're going to finish a study or our look at the Hebrew Tabernacle by looking at the Holiest of Holies. So in the sanctuary itself, you've got the two sections. You've got the holy place, where we talked before about the golden lampstand, about the table of golden table of showbread, and then the place of worship. And what we see is that between this in the holy place, and the holiest of holies is this curtain, which is very, very substantial. And it's probably was about 12 centimeters, so about 6-7 inches thick. And it must have been extremely heavy because it was made of this woven fabric, and you've got all of the different colors that are involved with this, and of course a picture or a sketch drawn into or woven into the veil of these two great angelic persons. Now, we talked right at the very beginning of this whole grafted olive branch learning community about the high priest going into the sanctuary on the Day of Atonement. So I covered quite a bit there in terms of the priest as he transferred his, if you like, regular priestly garments for an all-white covering, and then enters in. So what I'm going to do is look at it from this point as he's just going into the sanctuary. Difficult to be absolutely sure how this works because he has to hold a small basin, you would say, dish with blood in it that has been taken from the altar of sacrifice. And then he has the golden censer, which is something like you would see in an Orthodox church. It's hangs down on a chain, and it's got a bowl, and in there are coals, and you put in the incense. And that somehow he also has to hold these three together. Now, was it that he went in and there was a place that he could just put these down, and that he then went and sprinkled blood? It really isn't necessary to get that perfect. But what I'm going to do to make the point, this is an ekphrasis. This is like a dramatic retelling of the story to illustrate the point, hopefully in a poetic manner. But we're going to say that he has these three elements together. Now, he has to get behind the curtain, which involves effort. He has to move that curtain. Now, remember, this curtain or veil is the veil that is torn in two when our Lord Jesus Christ cries out, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? And then says, it is finished. What is finished is his atoning work of death, of blood, of sacrifice, fully vindicated and authenticated in the resurrection, But at this point in the temple, not the tabernacle, because now we're in the temple in Jerusalem, the second temple that was ostensibly built by Herod, that the curtain that separates the holy place from the holiest of holies is torn in two, it's rent in two. It's a very violent action. It isn't like it just fell down. Could have done, it fell down, and so as a result of that, you can now just go straight in. And you look at verses, we to come boldly before the throne of God. That's a scary thing, to come boldly before the throne of God. Well, why? Because all of this preemptory, antecedent activity has caused the way to be made clear. Now, this veil is moved. I don't know if he uses his elbow, but now we see the priest is now in the holiest of holies. And in that place, it is dark. It is completely dark. Now, this is extremely important to kind of grapple with a little bit, because we think of the presence of God producing light. Yes, that is true. But when we look at light and the presence of God, we see this point where Moses goes up the mountain where he meets with God, and then he goes into the darkness, because God himself dwells only within himself. It's not like there's a house in the sky and God lives there, or that the universe is where he hangs out. We've got to get away from this. We're talking about an absolutely incomprehensible, ineffable mystery when we start talking about the presence of God. And that's what it's like when you come into the holiest of holies and it is dark. Now, there is shadow. There is, as I mentioned just from before, the coals, the burning coals on the censer give something of the light that is there. And as the priest takes blood and places it on the four corners of the Ark of the Covenant, and there are these two golden statues of the angelic whose wings meet at the tip, that he then, how it works out exactly in terms of the order isn't important for this, but blood is there because without the blood, man cannot approach God. Simple as that. And God will not approach man because God's heart beats for man. For man, for man. He loves man. But he knows that his presence would consume. It would actually consume everything if he did not somehow place some mysterious veil over himself and gradually aletheia unveil the truth to the people of God. So the blood has to be there. Now we realize that the presence of God is focused or evidenced by the presence of smoke over the mercy seat. That's the lid to the Ark of the Covenant, what the blood has been placed upon. And interestingly, the word for mercy seat in the Greek is hilasterion. Hilasterion. It's actually the same today in modern Greek, or so I've been told. So hilasterion, and hilasterion is also the Greek word used in the New Testament for substitution. For substitution, the blood is a substitution for us. The sacrifice is a substitution so that we can come near God. And so above this hilasterion, this mercy seat, this substitution that's got blood on it, we see the presence of God. There is this indicative presence of God in this smoke. And then the high priest, with his censer, the burning coals, and it must have been terrifying, quite frankly. Although I would say there's something about the presence of God that both terrifies and warns you at the same time. It's like wanting to run away and yet wanting to run towards, all at the same time. And I know that's mysterious, but send me a note and I'll explain it more to you. But as he's walking towards this Ark of the Covenant, he pours incense into the censer and it erupts with smoke. And as he walks, he chants and he says, Yahweh, 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 Yahweh. Now, was he really saying Yeshua, Yeshua, Yeshua? Some people say that that is ultimately how Yahweh would have come out with the vowels put in there, if you like. We don't need to go there for that. What we do know is that the holiness of God is so intense, the only word that he can say is Yahweh, Yahweh, Yahweh. And as he walks, the smoke that is erupted out of his censer moves towards the smoke of the presence of God, and the smoke of man and the smoke of God mingle and become one. This is what in 1 Peter, where Peter talks about becoming partakers of the divine nature. There is a place prepared for us beyond this finite world, whereby we will fully participate within the divine nature. All we can say is that will be the moment when we are thoroughly and utterly and absolutely fulfilled to be what God has prepared us to be. And we can have bits of that. We can have, through glass darkly, bits of that along the way. But that is where it's going. And this experience, right back there, 1,500 years before our Lord Jesus, this idea of God and man becoming one, man partaking of the divine nature, is illustrated as that smoke pours out from the censer and mingles with the smoke of God and become one. Everything that we have looked at leads up to this point. Moses being out in the desert or in the wilderness amongst the Midianites, married one, daughter of the high priest, very complex. But Moses going back via the burning bush to Egypt and then leading the Hebrews out of Egypt, coming down into the wilderness and then receiving these clear commands from God. This is what I want you to do. Build me a sanctuary so that I may dwell among you. All of this leads up to the point where the blood of substitution covers that mercy seat so that the smoke of God and the smoke of man can become one, as a picture of where the blood of Christ is ultimately leading us today. Now, just to finish with this, let's now look at it a little bit more like it's a model, so we won't try to even play around being in that holiest of holies, but we'll look at it like a model. And so you've got all of these elements that we've spoke, but let's take the mercy seat off of the Ark of the Covenant, and because it's a model, you can place it down by the side and not be consumed in the process. And when you look down inside the Ark of the Covenant, there are three things that are in there. One, the tables of stone that God placed his commandments on, the golden pot of manna, because we'll see how God in his provision provides food, and so some of that manna is inside that pot. And then lastly, the rod of Aaron that budded almonds. And if you remember, there's a big revolution, something like what happens in churches today, where this faction and that faction, they want to follow this guy and this guy wants to follow this guy, and depends who you're married to and who your brother-in-law is and who your wife is and so on. It's the same old stuff. And there's this rebellion. And so God says to Moses, get each of the heads of these different factions to bring their rod and lay it down before me, and then have Aaron to put his rod down. And of course what we see is the outcome, the result is that supernaturally Aaron's rod blossomed. I'd love to see something like that. I've never actually ever really seen like a physical miracle. I hear about them all the time, but never actually seen one myself. But the idea of seeing a dry piece of wood suddenly come into bloom, and then clusters of nuts begin to grow there. What a picture of the authority of God. Now, these three elements are inside the Ark of the Covenant. And it's really quite wonderful because they represent three extremely and fundamental aspects of the Christian life. Firstly, there are the tables of stones. The tables of stone, which is the commands of God. So there's a word in Hebrew that comes out over and over again in the Old Covenant, where God then he calls a person's name, and the person replies by saying Hineni. I think it's Hineni, I think is how you pronounce it. And Hineni is, I'm here, I'm ready, and I'm ready to obey. Now, one could say that if you heard the voice of God, you'd have to be nuts not to say that. But it's important to get the point that when God speaks, when God gives a command, the response is Hineni. I'm here, I'm willing, I'm listening. Tell me what to do and I'm going to do it. So that idea of command and obedience is fundamental to the Christian life. And you could say that really anything that goes wrong is ultimately because the commands of God haven't been obeyed. And when I say go wrong, that's not strictly how I meant to say it, in terms of where there is sin and the consequences of sin. It is because where the command of God has been given and We have not said hineni. We've said something like, yes, but, or can I do that later, or something else. So, command from God, obedience, point number one, fundamental for the Christian life. Secondly, the pot of manna. And now this is very important. And I would say it's one of the hardest areas for those of us who work in the ministry. And so we don't go and do a job and go to a place and clock in and clock out and then get some money or something like that, where we have to look to God to provide for our needs, which means that provision for our needs comes from God. Now, I would say that is also in answer to prayer, and I would also say that you've got elements of being obedient to the commands of God there. But for Israel, as they are in the wilderness and going through this tremendous pressure in terms of living in the wilderness, it was by the grace of God and by the provision of God that they were able to eat every day. And so trusting God for our provision is fundamental. It's interesting because I try to talk about this in certain places, and I get a lot of, yes, but you don't understand our situation. And I'm sensitive to that. But in the final analysis, we have to understand that God provides for us in answer to prayer. That's the second great aspect of the Christian life. If we try to take control of ourselves and come up with our techniques and our various plans, it's going to go wrong. So, the command of God, obedience to God. Provision of God in answer to prayer, not our own schemings and abilities. And then lastly is the Aaron's rod that budded. You see, there's different types of authority. There is the authority of power, which in some senses is not even authority. But you have the authority to power, and I have the power to force you, to blackmail you, to intimidate you, to manipulate you into doing what I want you to do. You then have authority that is a healthy authority, and that can be purely you drive down the road and it says go at 120 kilometers an hour as the maximum speed, and you make the decision to do that. I have to confess, I break this a lot, so there's a confession. But we know that that little policeman hiding behind that bush with that camera, checking how fast you go, has the authority to stop you and say, you have done wrong and you need to pay. Now, there's an aspect of this, because I realize that a lot of people who are watching these videos are in Eastern Europe watching it with different subtitles. And I was in Romania, and I didn't even know I was speeding. It was one of these things where you could go 80 kilometers an hour on this difficult, narrow piece, but you had to go 50 kilometers an hour on this wide open piece. So that's a different story. But I was going too fast, and the policeman pulled me over, and he said, you have to pay a fine. I think it was like 30 euros, 50 euros, something like that. And I said, I don't have any money with me, so I'll have to go to the ATM. And he said, look, I'll tell you what, if you don't need a receipt, I'll give it to you for 30 euros, which of course we know that he was going to put that straight in his pocket. And I said, no, I work for the church, which is a great line, because it confronts where they're at. And I said, I work for the church, so I have to do this legally. So he said, okay, go to the ATM. And I turned around, then he came running over and he said, look, because you work for the church, I'm going to let you go, but next time you go to church, pray for me. And so I did. So now there's authority, there's a good authority there, in as much as I broke the law and I should have paid the fine, and he was the authority to implement and exercise that authority. Now, where the authority went wrong was that he tried to get by with getting a bribe in that situation. But that authority is not power, it's a healthy authority. But then you come to this third area of authority, which is supernatural authority. It's the authority of God. And the authority of God is so important to understand, because everybody can be against you. Everything can be going wrong. You can be misunderstood. But if you are being obedient to the commands of God, trusting Him for the provision, He exercises His authority over you and does that which is right for you. And so this last area of God's supernatural authority is that third part of what takes place when we look inside that Ark of the Covenant and see this beautiful unfolding, unveiling, aletheia unfolding of truth. So we'll put the lid back on to the Ark of the Covenant, and we'll quietly just walk out from the holiest of holies into the holy place, and then turn round for one last look at that beautiful golden lampstand, that table of showbread and that altar of incense, and then go out and then hear the noise again and see the bowl of washing that we need, that washing of the word. We need Jesus to wash our feet, as it were. And then we stop and we glance just for a moment at the blood of the altar and understand there is no other reason that we're even allowed in this place. It's not by fulfilling a set of rules. It's not the list. It's not being good or being righteous or anything else like that. It's all because of the blood of the everlasting covenant. And we walk out of the one entrance and we come back into our world, a world with families and villages and cities and nations and many nations. These principles will give us what is necessary to survive, to live, and to influence for godliness the world around us. And may that be what happens in your life and in my life. Bless you.